Once again, good evening, everybody. My name is Alan Friedman, Vice President of the Australian Jewish Association, and I have the pleasure of again being the MC for the evening. Also visible on your screens are David Adler, President of the AJA, my co-host for tonight, Michael Bird, so good evening to you as well as to our special guest for tonight, Rabbi Dov Lipman, who we will introduce in a moment. The format will be very much as before. Tonight we'll be speaking with Dov for about 30 minutes, after which we will open up the discussion with a live Q&A session from the audience. So as always, please have some questions ready. Now, just a reminder again, for those that are not regulars here, please indicate your interest in asking a question by clicking on the participants icon at the bottom and then on the raise hand or green tick icon along the bottom of that little screen, and that way we'll know that you want to ask a question. The chat function's up and going as usual. I can see there's already a couple of comments, so please feel free to send messages to the audience during the discussion. And as David mentioned, everybody has been muted to prevent those annoying noises during the first part of the session, but we will allow people to unmute themselves for question time. Most of the audience will be familiar with the great work of media watchdog organisation Honest Reporting, which is one of the organisations around the world that scours the media for bias and inaccuracy when reporting on Israel and the Middle East. Honest Reporting also run exceptional missions to Israel, where the participants are taken on an inside and in-depth journey into the politics of the region. And I know this because my wife Goldie and I did this mission in 2017, and it was one of the highlights of our trip to Israel that year. So whenever international travel starts up again, I strongly recommend this mission to all of you, as it squarely focuses on our area of interest, which of course is Israel advocacy. Now, there's never any shortage of news about Israel, and to touch on a few subjects of interest in recent weeks, we're delighted to have Dov Lipman join us tonight. Rabbi Dov Lipman is an American-born former teacher of Judaic studies in Washington who emigrated to Israel with his family in 2004, at which point he entered politics and became a member of Knesset with Yesh Atid. He is a prolific commentator in both print and electronic media, and he has authored 7 books on Judaism and Israel. He's currently the Senior Manager for Outreach with Honest Reporting, and it is in this role we have the pleasure of speaking to him tonight on a range of issues relating to politics in Israel. Dov, welcome to Australia, welcome to AJA's weekly Zoom session.
Thank you so much, Alan. As you mentioned, looking forward to people returning to Israel. I too look forward to returning to Australia, where I've had numerous very productive and enjoyable visits, and hopefully that time will come soon for all of us.
I hope so. So Dov, just to start off with, can you firstly tell us a little of what a day in the life of Honest Reporting is like?
The Honest Reporting day starts early morning. We have a WhatsApp group amongst the editorial team, and starting at 6:15 a.m., all of a sudden we start sharing articles with each other. We all go through what we call the morning read, where you basically scour the news sites from all around the world to see, first and foremost, are there issues that we need to address? Issues meaning outright falsehoods that have been said about Israel. Those falsehoods come in many different forms. Just as an example, an article that just in passing says in the capital city of Israel, Tel Aviv. That's just an example of an outright falsehood, which has to be corrected. Sometimes it's more misleading, where you'll have Israel in a conflict with Gaza, and it talks about Israel's Air Force attacking Gaza without any context whatsoever about what led Israel to take that defensive effort. So we look through all the sites, and then we get together first thing in the morning for an editorial meeting. And during that meeting, the head of the editorial section, Charles Bilbitzer, he will then basically talk with everybody on the editorial team, and everyone has their responsibilities. There are going to be critiques that are going to be written, where we just post on Twitter, post on Facebook, outright critique of the article. There is going to be articles that will be written, given more details about this falsehood and trying to get that truth out there. we might decide that we're going to do a shorter video called a watch it video, which is just about a minute or so without any person actually speaking, but that's the way we'll get the word out there. Or if it's serious enough, it might actually warrant a full feature video. That we have a state-of-the-art studio in the heart of Jerusalem, and we might put out a video of that kind. The number one goal of all of this is certainly getting a correction. That's the number one goal, and that's something we celebrate when it happens. We just had one recently. CNN, just the other day, wrote an article about the falling apart of the Oslo Accords and gave zero context in terms of the fact that the Palestinian terror played a massive role in that, and basically all blame was put on Israel. We immediately tweeted it, Facebook, got it out there in all the various formats, and sure enough, CNN changed the piece. And the piece still has an anti-Israel slant, but at least they put in information about the Israeli side, and that's a critical component. We also prepare for what we call every day that we put out, which is the Israel Bites. I'm asking every single one of you, if you do not receive the Israel Bites every day, send me an email. My email address is dov@honestreporting.com, very straightforward, and you will get what I view as the most concise news roundup of daily news of Israel. So if you're looking for a one-stop shop for your news from Israel, it's our Israel Bites, and we'll send it to you every single day. And in the editorial meeting, we also talk about any background materials that we can provide. So in the Israel Bites, it doesn't just give you the news, but then it'll tell you, for more reading, click here. Very often that will be other people's articles, or very often it'll be our articles that we put out on a regular basis about various things that are happening in the news. Just as an example, yesterday was the opening session of the United Nations, of the world leaders speaking at the General Assembly. So we put out an article giving you the difficult history that Israel has had with the UN, so you can understand the context to everything that's happening. When we had the incredible peace accords last week between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain, so we put out background materials. What has been the buildup to this? What's the history of it? And when we saw, not that falsehoods were put out in the media, but when we saw that there was omissions in the media didn't really view it as such a big deal. Again, we wrote articles explaining why this really is a big deal, explaining what these peace deals mean, and calling on international media outlets to do something about it. Aside from Israel stories, we're also always on the look for anti-Semitism. Whether it's anti-Semitism is not being reported properly or catching people in writing things improperly, we will make sure to put out videos, put out articles, and include it in our critiques as well in our social media, because there has to be that voice out there. I will tell you that our video project, which started just a few years ago, we've now reached a point where we have it down to a real science, where it reaches 20 million viewers per year. We're able to target the age group, looking for the ages of 18 to 34 is the primary group that we're looking for. And we're able to see, where is it going? Is it going to the audiences that we want, and try to generate real change and real conversation about the facts about Israel instead of the way it's presented often in international media. I'll add one more point. We also look out for articles which get it right. We're not here just to be the watchdog and just to call out the media when something is done improperly. But if we do see that an article in the mainstream media covers Israel in a positive way, in the correct way, we will absolutely give praise to that as well. Just as an example, in the wake of all of the Black Lives Matter movement in America, which then led to significant anti-Semitism from some of the leaders of that movement, I did a video which has now reached about 500,000 people, where we praised broadcasters from ESPN, the sports network, because they called out any Black Lives Matters people who also then give into any kind of anti-Semitism. And they said anti-Semitism is also a form of racism. So we praised them for that. We also look, one last point, Alan, we look for any action items that we can take. Are there any petitions that we can call to try to get something to be changed? Just to give you an example from a few months ago, way back in the summertime, a few months ago, when the Louis Farrakhan in the beginning of July gave a horrific anti-Semitic speech, which was on YouTube, and it was sitting there on this YouTube channel. and we started a petition, and we were part of the effort to get it removed from that channel. So it's not just mainstream media, it's also what's happening on social media. So just in the first few hours of the day, when most people are first getting their coffee, we've already been hard at work planning out our day. And then throughout the day on Facebook, on Twitter, in our email blast lists, all of these different material, on our YouTube channel, all of these materials will come out.
Yeah, fascinating. Just before we get into the nitty-gritty of issues, when we did the tour, they showed us the Media Central project. So perhaps just tell everybody what that's about, and then we'll get into some nitty-gritty.
Okay, absolutely. Many people aren't aware about this.
My screen seems to have frozen. Is anybody else's?
Yes. Yeah, they're all there.
Have we still got? Dov seems to have.
He's there.
He's online, but he's.
Oh,
What?
just unmute him. Dov, sorry, our screens froze for the last minute, so perhaps just start again.
That's okay, no problem. Over time, we discovered that it's not just enough to see the media, correct the media, call them out for being anti-Israel, but we also determined that we have to be proactive. There are hundreds of foreign journalists that are stationed in Israel. It's the third highest in the world in terms of numbers of foreign journalists that are here. And are they being told or guided to the right story to begin with? We know that certainly the Palestinian side is very strong in terms of working the media, and there has to be an avenue for those journalists to be given the Israeli side of the story as well. So Media Central does that. It does that with site tours to bring the foreign media to sites to see the Gaza border, see the border in Lebanon, to even experience cultural things in Israel, which show things that are not being covered around the world when Israel's portrayed as being so racist and discriminatory, and just be aware of the truth of what's happening on the ground. Those visits, along with phone conferences that we can arrange very, very quickly as real news is breaking with experts to give real context and real information, have a massive, massive effect in the international media. It's not something where you see. It doesn't say, we heard this at Media Central or through honest reporting. It's just a foreign journalist who was here, who took advantage of our programs and then used it in their features all around the world to tens of millions of people. So just as an example, recently when we were experiencing the kites coming in from Gaza that were torching acres and acres of land in Israel, and also wreaking havoc and fear in everyone living in the area around Gaza, we did an event together with the foreign journalists where we not only focused on the problem on the ground, but also Israel's solution in terms of a new technology with lasers that can shoot them down, the balloons and the things when they're in the air, before the inflammatory object actually gets to the ground. And Yahoo News, as an example, featured that story. Yahoo News is rated as one of the top news outlets in the world. So we're talking about millions of people who are now able to get the true story before it even happens in a negative way. And that's proactively telling Israel's story. So through these conferences, through these site visits, remarkable things happen in the media in terms of telling Israel's side and not it being a twisted anti-Israel piece. And I want to give you an example. When we brought the journalists to Gaza, obviously pre-corona, while they were there one time, and this wasn't arranged in any way, there was a siren. And they experienced, foreign journalists experienced what people living in the Gaza area have to go through. And it had a massive impact on the way those journalists reported the story. So it's not just about the conflict, it's also about various things that are happening in the Arab population and the Ethiopian population, get them to write stories about other things that are happening in Israel in a positive light. So it's a real full court press, as I call it. On the one hand, being on the defense, seeing when there are things that are being reported improperly, trying to get those corrections or at least calling them out for it, getting out those videos about the real information about Israel's background and the full story, fighting anti-Semitism as well, and then Media Central actually working with the journalists to get the story right to begin with, and that automatically goes to tens of millions of people around the world.
Well done. Michael?
Yes. So hi, Dov. Thanks for joining us. Just on a side note, you mentioned Black Lives Matter before, just to show you what a battle we had if we can't even convince our own people. One of our most well-known rabbis 2 weeks ago had a Zoom event with an American liberal rabbi telling us how we should be supporting the Black Lives Matter movement. So that just shows you how we have a problem within our own as well from outside the community.
Well, I want to emphasize that certainly at Honest Reporting, we work very, very hard to be apolitical. And in fact, in our own newsroom and editorial room, you will find people ranging from right-wing to left-wing, religious to secular. We have Jews and non-Jews working for the organization, and we very much work hard to toe that line. So I don't have any kind of an issue, or we as an organization, with anybody who's battling racism anywhere. We certainly support that battle, and we don't believe that it's only about the Jewish people. What we will call out is any kind of hypocrisy, where it's any people who are fighting for racism and discrimination against one group and not against all groups. And that's why it was important for us when there was a news organization that did highlight that and said that if we are going to fight for the African-American community in America and fight against racism, then fighting anti-Semitism has to be part of that. And that was something which we certainly applauded.
Yeah. Now, look, recently our perennial anti-Zionist ABC news reporter described Palestinian rocket attacks as just symbolic. And this Australian ABC reporter went on to almost defend the Hamas narrative. Now, you responded in a tweet, which I happened to notice, about this dreadful reporting. So my question really is, how did you find out about this reporter, and has there been any response to it?
Just before you answer, Dov, David, are we able to show that ad? We actually have that ad.
Yes, I can just give me a minute and I'll bring it up. Yeah, can do.
It takes about a minute. Just have a look at what the ABC put to air not so long ago.
Just make sure it's okay. This is the compilation from Honest Reporting.
So this as an example, so this is the, I believe it's probably the watching video that we put up.
The rocket attacks, I mean, they sound like a lot, but in the context of the last couple of years, they are nothing compared to some of the recent escalations. There were a couple of rockets fired. There was largely symbolic. Hamas timed it to show that it opposes the deal. The actual conflict between Palestinians and Israel is ongoing. The military occupation by Israel, the world's longest, is ongoing.
Take us through this. What happened?
Sure. So that's a classic example. As part of the, it wasn't even the morning read. I saw that in the evening time in Israel, and immediately I put it out to our editorial board in the WhatsApp group. And then first thing in the morning, we decided, okay, how are we going to address that? Let's remember what he said. He called a rocket attack where we have video footage of a man lying on the ground injured. He called that symbolic. That was problem number one. Problem number two was when he described the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, he said, with Israel's military occupation the longest in the world. Basically suggesting that this entire conflict is because of Israel. No context, no mentioning of Israel's overtures for peace, no mentioning of Palestinian terrorism and the role that that plays in the conflict. And therefore, we decided that we're going to address it in a few different ways. First of all, tweeting it out there, tagging him, tagging ABC Australia over and over again. I have my own Twitter page, and you're all certainly welcome to join not just Honest Reporting's Twitter, but mine as well. I, over and over again, called for him to apologize, take back what you said. And we put out that Watch It video, which again, we put out on all of our platforms, which reaches huge amounts of people, just to call them out for it. Now, this is an example of a situation where there wasn't a response. There wasn't any kind of an apology from the reporter, and nor did ABC Australia walk back from it. However, we believe two things. Number one, we cannot be silent no matter what. Someone is going to call a rocket attack into an Israeli city symbolic. We're not going to tolerate that, and we're not going to allow that to go quietly. So just first and foremost, we have to be strong and stand up and speak against it. But number two, we don't have a doubt that as we tag ABC Australia and this reporter over and over again, they see what we're putting out there. No one wants to be targeted in a negative way, and we hope that it will impact the way they report about it in the future as well. So sometimes you can't track the precise result, but at least there's an honest supporting voice being out there, making sure that no one is silent, and it's not just individuals who might be sitting at home watching this themselves and being frustrated, but there's an actual organization with a massive reach that's getting the word out there.
Yeah, well done. Dov, just changing topics a little, you wrote an article recently on how Harvard University recently announced that Saeb Erekat, the chief Palestinian negotiator for the PLO, is joining their school for the upcoming year. It all seems rather bizarre. Just take us through that. What happened and what can be done about it?
Yeah, it's another example where just on the simple morning read, Googling, trying to get a sense for what's out there about Israel, Palestinians, Middle East, someone on our editorial team came across this announcement that Harvard has not only invited Saeb Erekat to be on the faculty, but he's on a special program that's teaching diplomacy to people who are the future leaders. Let's remember, Harvard, this is the Kennedy School of Government, which produces prime ministers all around the world, foreign ministers, members of parliament, city leaders, mayors, and this is where they'll be hearing from Saeb Erekat about diplomacy. So we immediately, first of all, put out an extensive article pointing to not just his failures in diplomacy, because it's not an issue of is he a good diplomat or not, but we pointed to his being part of the rejection of Israel's offer in Camp David, about 96% what the Palestinians were asking for. We've talked about his involvement in, pay for slay, in allowing terrorists to get paid for killing innocent Israelis, for a lot of his anti-Semitic rhetoric over the years. And we asked Harvard University, this is who you're going to have on your faculty. But then we took it one step further, and we began a petition. We put out a video about it to petition Harvard University, which we will have presented to them already, with thousands of people on it, calling them to rethink this decision, that this is not acceptable. Will Harvard turn back on it or not? We don't know. You don't know where it's going to go. But again, at least there's a voice that's out there, and Honest Reporting is doing that, also coalescing everyone together who agrees to take action. It's not just complaining, but we're actually trying to do something about it. And if there is enough noise, and if it just does get picked up by the media, then it is possible that Harvard will reconsider it, or at the very least, when it comes to the next time they bring in visiting professors, they'll think twice before they bring in someone who is so anti-Israel, so anti-Semitic, and so not worthy of speaking to future leaders about diplomacy.
Yes. Would they have done this because they've trying to portray some sense of balance? I mean, would they have a pro-Israel equivalent on campus and they would argue that this is for balance, or do they not even bother about that?
They did have, on the visiting faculty, they did have Mrs. Baird, I believe, from Australia, who's viewed as being on a pro-Israel stance. But there's a difference between having a foreign leader who seems to side with Israel sometimes, and bringing in the person who has been in the rejectionist camp of the Palestinians along the way. If they brought in someone from the Israeli negotiating team, from the Israeli government, then I could say, you know what, that's fair debate. And we are open to fair debate, and we are open to hearing all sides of the story. But that's where we feel that it was very much slighted to the Palestinian side. The students are going to be hearing from somebody who was in the room in all of these negotiations, and will certainly come with a laundry laundry list of all the wrongs about Israel and in no way taking any responsibility on the Palestinian side. And that's where it's dishonest. And that's where honest reporting kicks in to try to make things right.
Yep. Michael?
Dov, one of Australia's most anti-Israel media outlet has the Age newspaper in Melbourne and its sister paper in Sydney, the Sydney Morning Herald. This organisation has Mahir Mughrabi as its foreign desk editor, a long-time Palestinian activist. He's actually born to Palestinian Scottish parents. In both newspapers recently, his articles did not reveal to their readers within his bio that he is a Palestinian activist. Now, Mughrabi also has an input, unfortunately, into the letters to the editor section. And we see that pro-Israel letters from myself and others never get published. How do you suggest we tackle these types of problems?
This is a classic example where I would ask you, Michael, after we finish here, to send me an email. Again, it's dov@honestreporting.com, and we will look into it. And it's something which we will likely do a piece about, because part of honest reporting is not just making sure that it's not anti-Israel, but also if there is something like that, where there's something sinister or people don't even realize who they're reading and what it's all about, to try to expose it, to try to call out the news outlet for it, to give them a chance to try to make things better. So that's the kind of thing where that would be a great piece for an article, for social media, to make sure to tag all the relevant people so that those in Australia understand who they're reading and where it's from. People around the world, that we find it's that 10% of the world might be in a absolutely, we're anti-Israel, we're pro-terrorist, but then there's another 90% where, I'll go even further. Let's say there's 10% that understand Israel and support Israel against terrorism. Then there's this middle 80% that don't really know much about it, and they're innocently reading materials. But if they know that they're reading materials from someone who is a terrorist sympathizer or is involved in any kind of pro-terrorist, pro-Palestinian movement, at least they have the context when they're reading that. So, and I would talk to everybody who's watching with us today. If there's an issue which comes up, let us know. Write to us at Honest Reporting. There's a contact us on the website as well. And by the way, check the website regularly for articles if you're not receiving the email blasts. And if you are aware of something that we can tackle, definitely contact us.
Okay. Now, I'm happy to throw the session open to any questions if anybody has anything, but you do need to let us know. If I'm correct, David Schulberg, did you want to ask a question? If so, please unmute yourself and fire away.
David Schulberg.
Are you there, David?
I can't see him.
No.
Okay. Okay. Well, if you spot him, we'll let him know. Dov, just on this whole media thing, we noticed that our Australian newspapers take a lot of their Middle East coverage reports directly from the New York Times and the Guardian, and these are two of the world's most anti-Israel news outlets. Why is a newspaper like the New York Times so obsessed with Israel more than any other country in the world?
Sure, I'll get to that. I just also want to mention to you that I see that Jeff Seidner has raised his hand for a question after we finish this one. The New York Times has certainly been a major issue with a major reach. And by the way, the fact that Barry Weiss, one of their reporters, stepped down because of the fact that there was anti-Semitism there. Now it's not an outside organization like Honest Reporting calling them out for it, but it's an insider themselves. So it's very, very clear that it's there. I have struggled to try to understand where the anti-Semitism comes from. It's something which is incredible how the same tropes that we've seen for so many years are coming back now. And all that we can do about it is speak out against it, educate about it. Because I'll tell you something, Alan, it's very interesting. In my travels around the world, I've discovered most people are against anti-Semitism. They're not against anti-Zionism or anti-Israel. And therefore, a lot of the anti-Israel rhetoric that you see is actually anti-Semitism that's masked as being anti-Israel because that's more politically correct. So we work very, very hard just to expose it, to expose the anti-Semitism wherever it can be. And that's the best that we can do. In fact, one of our videos that really went viral was the video way back when there was a cartoon in the New York Times editorial section about Trump being led as a seeing eye dog by Netanyahu, just all kinds of anti-Semitism there. And we were very involved in that effort to have that removed and to get some kind of an apology. So to analyze where the anti-Semitism comes from is very, very difficult. What we have to be able to do is to be vigilant and to call it out when it's happening, to call out the double standard, to call out the tropes, and to never rest, to always be out there 24 hours a day, tweeting about it, video on Facebook, getting it on YouTube, because that's the only thing that can work to put any kind of pressure. Because I will say again, anti-Semitism is, at this point in time, in the broader world, is not politically correct. It's not accepted, and people don't want to be called out for being anti-Semitic. So it's very important that we do that wherever and whenever it happens.
Okay, thank you. Jeff, please unmute yourself and ask your question. And then we've got Leon.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Absolutely.
Greetings, shalom. The left have become far more blatant with their Jew hatred. Probably the best exemplar of that is Farrakhan, and his commendation of Hitler was a good man, and the Jews are akin to rats. It would have taken you a lot of effort to have it removed, etc. This is a generalized comment of mine. It must be it must make your job far more difficult if they are so blatant and not even ashamed of putting that on Facebook and stayed there for years, for months, actually, months. That's my question. How do you cope with the blatantly of it?
Sure. One of the efforts that we're involved with, and actually one of our representatives actually testified in the Knesset about this issue, is the issue of social media and what are they allowing to remain there and what is taken down. Because officially, they don't allow hate speech. So why are they allowed to keep tweets up from the president of Iran, from the Ayatollah, saying such horrible things about Israel, and yet we can't get things that are anti-Israel taken down? And then if we say there are tweets that are taken down sometimes that are taken as anti-Hamas or other groups, and they're allowed to stay. We're working very hard right now on getting the social media platforms, and we're part of the broader effort, not just on the supporting, to get there's an international definition from IRA of what is anti-Semitism, and that should not be allowed on any of the platforms. And we're seeing a positive response so far from the heads of these platforms, and we're not going to stop working until we know that it's built into their system that if anything anti-Semitic is put up, it will be removed. And as you said, there is so much out there. There are groups, neo-Nazi groups that are just outright anti-Semitic, calling for another Holocaust, calling for more genocide of Jews, and we're working very, very hard on that front, and certainly contacting Twitter and Facebook and YouTube whenever we see any kind of example of outright anti-Semitism on their platforms, and working with them to get that removed. But you are right that it is a constant battle, and our editorial team is constantly on alert and checking for anything which hints of anti-Semitism to make sure that it's removed.
Thank you. Leon is on audio only usually. So Leon, please ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I hear you.
Oh, yes. So good evening, Rabbi Lipman. First of all, I'd like to wish you a Shana Tova.
Thank you.
Now, Harvard is not the only important university in the USA to have appointed to its teaching staff a very inappropriate person. It seems to me that in many of the US universities, the people who appoint these sorts of people are themselves very much against the state of Israel. How they achieve their positions, I don't really know. However, does honest reporting ever make representations to the higher echelons of these universities, pointing out to them that these choices are highly inappropriate on purely academic grounds?
Yeah, so first of all, I have traveled to campuses all around the world, and you're 100% right that there is a strong anti-Israel sentiment. And one of the things that I found, just as a concern within the Jewish community, that put aside for a moment non-Jewish students, which is also a concern, but Jewish students, even some who grew up in Zionistic homes, strongly Jewish homes, go to these campuses, and they've been pro-Israel their whole lives. They celebrate Israel on Yom HaAtzmaut, and they talk about all of Israeli technology and things like that. And then all of a sudden they're presented on campus with Israel over here and human rights and justice over here. And a young college student is going to choose human rights and justice over Israel. It's presented in such a slanted, biased manner. So just by the way, to give you an example in terms of faculty, we just dealt with it this week. Layla Khalid, a member of the PFLP terrorist organization, who was involved, she was known as the first female hijacker in, I believe it was 1969. She is giving a Zoom conference, I think today, for San Francisco State University. She's the guest speaker. I mean, this is something which can't happen. So of course we put it on our all of our social media platforms and wanted people to be aware of it. There are actually attorneys that are working on it in terms of the U.S. Justice Department. But in terms of working with the presidents themselves, it's not an avenue that we definitely will tweet people. Oh, I see over here that James is telling us that they actually Zoom did not allow her to present. So if you want, we'll take that as a little bit of our effort as well. I wasn't even aware that it happened. We were going to follow up later on. There was a massive uproar about it. We put it out to huge amounts of people. And like I said, there were attorneys in America that fought against it. So just to give you a sense, fighting against it anywhere is critical. Going to the university presidents themselves, we will certainly call them out. We will certainly reference them in our materials. A simple letter from honest reporting to them won't have the same effect as a petition will. So once we have the petition, which is not just our limited organization, but thousands of people, then yes, that will be presented to the president of the university and hopefully have an impact. But in general, we find that their biggest concern is their image in the broader public. And if people are calling them out for it, people don't want to be stigmatized in that way. They want to be seen at the very least as being honest brokers and unbiased, even in universities. So our approach is to get the masses against them, get it out there on social media, and hopefully at that point, they'll pull back from it.
Thank you, Dov. Dennis, you can unmute yourself and ask your question. And then we have Eric, Bruce, Roland, Stephen, Joseph, and Saul.
I think we've also got David Schulberg unmuted now.
Okay, let's take David first because he was actually first in the queue, and then we'll go to Dennis.
Yeah, sorry for the hiccup before. I'm not quite sure what happened. I've got about 5,000 questions, but I'm only going to mention a couple of things, Dov. Firstly, for those who aren't aware, if I can just indulge myself for 1 second to mention that Dov was on the radio today on my radio program, the Israel Connection. So if they want to listen to Dov in a former life, they can tune into that program, which will be available on the podcast on the JA website. As far as the question's concerned, on the website for honest reporting, Dov, there has been a section called Honest Reporting Down Under. And it would appear if you go to the Honest Reporting Down Under page that in Australia, we really don't have any problems because there hasn't been an entry there since January of this year. So I would hope that we could see some resurgence of activity in Honest Reporting Down Under. And I would be more than happy to provide you with heaps of cases that could be included there. Further, just one other thing before I go, there's in reference to the age in the Sydney Morning Herald, there's actually potentially a complaint that's going to go to the Press Council over the article that came out a couple of weeks ago written by Andrew Jackson, which I wrote a piece that was published in The Spectator, which took it to task.
David, I don't want to cut you off, but we've got a lot of questions. So just ask your question briefly so we've got time for others as well, please.
Yeah, so I just want to say that, I suppose going back to what I'm saying to begin with, that we've got a lot happening in Australia, and I would hope that we could connect better with honest reporting to get some of these, I think, major incidents out there in the public arena.
So first of all, David, thank you for all the work that you do, and it's definitely appreciated. Everyone can be involved in this effort. And I will definitely talk to people to see about that segment of the website. We definitely will call out any news outlet, wherever it is around the world. And like we talked about before, we just dealt with ABC Australia. And certainly send us that information, and we'll make sure to do everything that we can with it. We do view all of you as partners in this effort. Our limited staff can only see so much. And if there are things that you're aware of and that we can get involved with, we would certainly want to join that effort and fight against anti-Israel bias and anti-Semitic rhetoric wherever it might be found.
Thank you. Now, Dennis, are you able to unmute yourself and ask your question, please? Dennis?
He's still muted.
Okay. I'm sure this is not a situation unique to Australia. We have a television station here called SBS. A lot of their feeds come from Al Jazeera. Now, Al Jazeera obviously has quite an anti-Israel bias, and it seems to me that this is probably not the only country in the world where news feeds are taken from Al Jazeera. What is being done more broadly about Al Jazeera, and what can we do here in Australia to ensure that SBS gets a less biased reference point than Al Jazeera?
So first of all, it's a great question. Al Jazeera has a right to have a station with their stance and their approach, and we can't close down any media outlets that we disagree with. And educating people to understand that Al Jazeera has that stance is certainly significant. I think we take it for granted that most people do understand that, but it could be that it is worthwhile to consider putting something out just to clarify that. But in terms of your point, let's say as an example, if that news station is always using Al Jazeera, and we can document that. We can document that they are always using Al Jazeera for their source of information. That would then be a basis for a really good article to explain how that's not honest reporting, because that's only taking one side of the story, and we'd be certainly willing to put something out about an issue of that kind. By the way, there is an element of Al Jazeera which we've been involved in trying to expose, and that is something called AJ+, which doesn't even say Al Jazeera, and it's this cool new age with it station that's reaching out to young people all around the world called AJ+, and it has stories about all kinds of things, and they mix in some of the anti-Israel, anti-Semitic rhetoric in there. So that's something which has to be exposed as well. But again, that's a classic example, Dennis, where if you see something that's happening and we can document it in a well-structured article, then that's the kind of thing that we'd want to put out there, because any news organization has to be open and transparent about where their sources are coming from, and viewers should at least know through some context that it's being slanted.
Yeah, thank you. Now, Ariel, if you could unmute yourself, just while he's doing that, Dov, with peace breaking out between the Gulf states and Israel as it is Qatar likely to change the way Al Jazeera functions, do you think?
I haven't heard much in terms of that. I mean, we don't really know where this is going to go. I will tell you that as time goes along, and more of the Arab states do normalize relations with Israel, I do believe it will have an impact in certain places. It will have an impact certainly in the UN. There's potential for change there. I know it's shocking to hear, but if you go to our website, you will see my article about this from yesterday, where so much of the anti-Israel sentiment in the UN was driven by the Arab League and by the Arab countries, and we'll see if any kind of a change takes place because of this normalization. So will that have a ripple effect to Al Jazeera as well? Certainly, if we have larger countries coming on board, if we want at some point reach Saudi Arabia, it's going to have to be written a little bit differently. So it'll be very interesting to see how that plays out. That's, by the way, among the benefits of Israel normalizing relations with these countries, even if it does come at some price, because it has so many hidden effects that we don't even see, aside from the outright trade and culture and tourism and things along those lines. There's so much else just by Israel being recognized. And just myself, I see the question about anti-Semitism. Unbelievable things are happening on the ground now between Israelis and people in the UAE, with them wishing us Shana Tova, and we want to learn more about your culture. And in the schools in the UAE, they're teaching more about Israel. So all of that will have an automatic impact on anti-Semitism, because young people, instead of growing up in a country which was officially anti-Israel, the existence of a Jewish state, now all of a sudden they changed the whole tone. So you're definitely going to see changes long-term in terms of anti-Semitism. That does not mean that will get rid of all radicals, and that doesn't mean you won't still see it, but it will have an impact for sure, both on the anti-Semitism and in terms of your question, Alan, I do believe it'll have some impact on the media coverage as well.
Okay, thank you. Ariel, please unmute yourself, and then we've got Bruce, Roland, Stephen, Joseph and Saul, hopefully.
Hello, good evening, Dov and Shana Tova. My name is Ron Tavhata. I'm in contact a lot with Tammy in California. You probably know her, regarding AMCHA with the universities. And I know that university students, especially Jewish university students, are going through a very, very difficult time in America and also places in Europe as well. They always hide behind free speech and academic freedom, and I think it's done. What would happen if donors to these universities are named and shamed that they are actually funding anti-Semitism? A lot of these donors are, by the way, Jewish. And if they are named and shamed and said and told, you are funding anti-Semitism, and if you don't suspend your donations, we are going to tell the public that what you're funding, and give them the evidence. Would that be feasible?
I don't think it's an impossible thing. I wouldn't say that it falls under the context of the mission and the goals of honest reporting specifically. Again, it's very much media related. So for example, even when we call out a university for bringing these people in, we also say, where's the media uproar about it? But I do believe, Ariel, that you've touched on a very, very, very good approach that Jewish organizations should definitely consider taking in terms of trying to make things better on the universities. It's an excellent, excellent idea.
Okay, thank you. Bruce, your turn. Please unmute yourself, and then Roland.
Good evening, Rabbi Lipman. How are you?
Thank God, doing great.
Fantastic. I just have a question with regard to the recent peace treaties between the UAE and, well, the normalization of relations between the UAE, Bahrain, and the State of Israel. Would you say that my only fear is that that might come a little bit from the old Islamic adage, the enemy of my enemy is a friend. Do you think that's politically designed to sideline Iran, or do you believe that there could be lasting peace based on that?
There are definitely two elements that are the driving forces behind these countries coming closer to Israel. One is the reality that Israel has emerged as a high-tech startup nation, so many wonderful things that are happening here, and they want to be part of that. But there's definitely also the driving force of the Iran, of working together against Iran, and they recognize the benefit that will come to them militarily, in terms of intelligence, by working together with Israel. So I think it's both of those forces that have come together to bring those countries to this point. But from what we've seen and what we've experienced, there's a real sincerity, at least in the current leadership as well. I think they all realize, and they'll give a lip service to the Palestinian issue, but they definitely realize that there's been a history of Palestinian rejectionism, and they've reached a point where they say, wait a minute, for the sake of this group that are paying terrorists to kill Israelis, rejecting every kind of peace offer, for that sake, we're going to now give up on benefiting from relationship with Israel on an economic and a cultural and a security level. We're just not going to do this any longer. So I think that Iranian element has certainly played a strong role in it. And there's no doubt, even before this was announced publicly, there has been significant cooperation already going on the Iranian issue. And there's no doubt that it benefits Israel to have some of the Arab states involved in that effort as well. So I think that's all those elements coming together that has brought us to this point. And not only will the Arab countries benefit, but Israel will also benefit significantly, both on an economic and also on the security front.
Thank you. Roland, please unmute yourself.
Shalom, Rabbi Lipman. Thank you so much for your hard work. I was just wondering, it might sound a bit naive, but with young journalists going to Israel, and in the initial stages, they're quite errant in their views, and some of them are very close to where you are, making an appointment to see them and presenting to them face-to-face evidence of what they're saying is incorrect and putting correctives in there. What's your view on that idea?
You mean meaning young anti-Israel students? Is that what you were saying? Okay, just wasn't sure if I misunderstood the question.
No.
We do make an effort. I certainly have met with many, many groups of students. In normal times, it's delegations on a weekly basis that come to Israel. And some of those students have included students from a group called Students from Justice of Palestine. I'm not going to have them walk away. They're not going to walk away afterwards as flag-waving Zionists, but at least they hear another perspective. I will never forget, I spoke to one group where there was a leader for SJP on one of the campuses in America that was in this group that I spoke to. And afterwards, she sent me an email where she said, listen to these words, I was the first Israeli leader that she ever heard express sadness as an Israeli that innocent Palestinians are killed in this conflict, which is crazy because, of course, Israelis and even the most mainstream leaders and right-wing leaders don't want innocent Palestinians to be killed, but she never heard that message before. So there's no doubt that meeting with these groups is worthwhile. It's important for them to hear the Israeli perspective. It's important for them to see when there's hypocrisy. I'll give you another example. To one group, I was talking about the security barrier, which they all call the apartheid wall. And when I showed them the statistics, just statistics, how many innocent Israelis were killed in the streets of Israel before the barrier was put in place, and how many after, they couldn't walk away by saying anything other than, wow, I didn't know that before. And that is misleading. They feel like they've been misled. So it's very important to be out there presenting that information. And there's no doubt that we work very hard we will talk to anyone and speak with anyone to try to present the facts and the figures so they can see things as much as possible for themselves.
Thank you. Stephen, please unmute yourself, then it's Joseph and Saul.
Can you hear me?
Yep, fire away.
Okay, Rebbe, thank you for your presentation. I agree that anti-Semitism presents a fertile ground for anti-Zionism, anti-Israel ideas. But it's not only thing. There is a political, economical, and other issues why countries anti-Israel and so on. But this previous question just right for my one. Through the history, I experienced that support for Israel, even among anti-Semites, very high when Israel strong and wins the war in 1967, 73. Like, for example, I saw anti-Semites, Ukrainian anti-Semites actually show respect to the Jews. But Israel, through the history, and even now, is not able to formulate direction where it's going and how it's going to resolve this conflict. And in my opinion, this is why everyone considering Israel as a target. You spend a lot of time, and you mentioned you have many people, hundreds of people involved in your organization.
Stephen, can you get to your question?
Yes, just a moment. Just a moment. And just recently you said you're only one Israeli politician who clearly expressed opinion about Israel and anti-Semitism. Have you actually talk and target Israeli politicians and Israel politics creation to make direction of the how to permanently resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict or Palestinian-Israeli conflict?
Well, it's a great question, Stephen. One of the things that we try to point out is, first of all, just as a fact, that Israel has made numerous attempts to resolve this conflict. So many people out there know nothing about Camp David in 2000, where Prime Minister Ehud Barak, whether people here agree with his idea or not, was willing at a certain point to give 96% what the Palestinians wanted in exchange for peace. And not only was it rejected, but Arafat unleashed a second intifada as a result, which killed and injured thousands of Israelis in the streets of Israel. People aren't aware of the Gaza disengagement, whether you agree with it or not, in 2005, where Israel pulled out fully from the Gaza Strip, tried to give the Palestinians a chance to build an ideal society there, and then Hamas took over, and it's become an increased launching pad of rockets into Israeli cities. People are not aware of Ehud Olmert having made an offer which was never even responded to. Again, offers which some of us might disagree with, but they were made and were rejected. And Israel doesn't have a path forward right now on the Palestinian conflict because there is no path to go forward. If someone's asking me to commit national suicide for the sake of a piece of paper, we're not going to do that. There has to be a Jewish state in this land. It has to be a strong Jewish state. Going back to the 67 borders are indefensible, as they were called by Levi Eshkol, they're Auschwitz borders. So we're not going to be asked to do something which means the destruction of Israel. By the way, when I speak to groups, I walk them through that. I explain why are the 67 borders indefensible, explain the topography to them, the high ground versus the low ground, the water. There's so many elements that people just don't know. It's so easy to have a slogan which says, make peace with the Palestinians. I also expose, and this is very important, we also expose that the movement that says free Palestine, certainly BDS, that's a movement for the destruction of Israel. When they say from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, they mean no Israel. So at the moment, we have not found that path forward. So you ask me, is there an Israeli politician who will say, this is the path forward to peace? Put aside Likud or Naftali Bennett for a moment. Even a politician from the Meretz party, from the more left-wing liberal party in the Knesset, can't sit in front of you and say, here's the path towards achieving peace with the Palestinians, other than giving them 100% of what they want, which means the destruction of Israel. But having said that, because it was interesting when you asked the question, you said the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Israeli-Arab conflict. And that's where you touched on an amazing point. Because what we've experienced now recently is that the broader Israeli-Arab conflict, starting with the Arab rejection of the partition plan in 1947, going to the Arab ganging up on Israel in 1967, going to their 3 no's after the Six-Day War, where Israel offered all the land back and said, just for the sake of peace, and they said, no negotiations, no recognition, no peace, to the Yom Kippur War and beyond, and boycotts, etc. Now, all of a sudden, Arab countries are saying, we want to try to resolve this, and it's peace for peace or peace for strength, however you want to say it. That, I do believe, Stephen, will have an impact on the Palestinian conflict. At a certain point in time, as more and more Arab countries recognize Israel and normalize relations, the Palestinians, who already feel very abandoned by all of this, there is no doubt that they will at some point, something will happen. And it could be 10 years from now, or it could be 80 years from now, come to the table and say, we want to figure out how to make this work on terms that might not be the dream for Israel, but won't be Israel's destruction as a result, terms that Israel can live with. And we'll have to see what happens along those lines. But as long as the Palestinian leadership is continuing to talk about 67 borders, right of return, Temple Mount, those things, there's a point where Israel cannot agree to all of those demands. And that's where, unfortunately, I think that we're stuck now. And I say unfortunately, as a father of a young man who served in the Israeli army, we don't want our children serving in these areas. We don't want our children in conflict. We will lay down our arms the moment we don't have to defend ourselves. But as long as they're continuing to attack us and seeking to destroy us, there's very little that we can do. But we have shown with Egypt, Jordan, the UAE, Bahrain, and the countries that follow, that we are open to peace the moment they're willing to recognize Israel and accept our existence in this land.
Yeah, thank you. Now, we'll just take the last couple of questions because we are out of time. And Joseph and Saul, but please keep them brief because we don't like running over time. So Joseph, please unmute yourself. Joseph, are you there? Okay, let's go to Saul. Saul, are you there?
Yep.
Okay, right.
Right. What I'd like to ask is, you do a fantastic job. You use resources that are incredible. You have personnel that are absolutely dedicated. But should the government itself not be doing that job? Or is it that the government lack the personnel, lack the oomph, lack the willingness to do what you people do? Or do you think it is better coming not from a government, but from an organization that is, as it were, outside of government itself?
It's a really good question, Saul. And by the way, I just want to mention, if you did not have a chance to ask your question, please feel free to email me. I'm open to answering your questions beyond this conversation. So dov@honestreporting.com, or you can find me on Facebook. Feel free. So no one should feel that they were taken away from the possibility of having their questions answered. There's no doubt that the Israeli government, on the one hand, obviously there's a foreign ministry and there are ambassadors around the world, and there's a Ministry of Strategic Affairs, and they definitely try to be out there doing the job. There's been a lot of criticism of the failures of the government to really do it in a professional, well thought out manner with the right professionals. As an example, in Honest Reporting, we have young, talented people who are dealing with the social media generation that I wouldn't necessarily know how to reach, but they know exactly how to reach them and to make sure that the messaging is exactly the way it's supposed to be. So there is no doubt that organizations like Honest Reporting do pick up slack that could be done by the Israeli government. But having said that, there is also always a weakness in it being the Israeli government itself involved in a specific initiative, in terms of people saying that it's automatically tainted and the like. So there's always a balance that has to be played. But can the government be doing a better job? There's no doubt that in terms of messaging, when I was in the Knesset, we were working very hard on creating a structure for the messaging where it goes from the foreign minister straight to the ambassadors, straight to advocates in the field. And I didn't manage to get that together. There's a lot of work and rehabilitation that has to take place in the foreign ministry. But from our perspective, without getting into the nitty-gritty of the government, once the government is not fully in that place, we want to be doing so. I will say that even if the government was doing a better job in terms of Israel advocacy and education, I still believe there would be a need for organizations like Honest Reporting to be out there monitoring. That's not necessarily within the framework of the government, and to make sure that we have the staff and the ability to make the corrections when they need to be made.
Okay, thank you. Now, we really do need to finish. Joseph, if you're there, can you please unmute yourself very quickly and ask your question? No? Doesn't look like it. Okay, all right. We'll have to finish off at this point. Dov, thank you so much. Before I hand back to David, thank you so much. There's a million more questions that we could have asked you, and we'll have to have you back another time. So we'd be delighted to do that. Thank you again, and Shana Tova to you and everybody in Israel. David, I'll hand back to you to just wrap up, please.
If I could just jump in before David and say thank you to all of you for your work, for the work that your association does. And I certainly encourage everyone who's watching to get involved. Thank you for your interest. I will also definitely say that Honest Reporting, we work really hard, and we also definitely need support. So anyone who wants to get involved in that, just go to our website or email me, and we definitely can partner together. And I will answer all of your questions also at dov@honestreporting.com. And I want to wish all of you as well a Shana Tova, a good, healthy, prosperous, successful year. And I look forward to continuing the communication one to the other. And thank you for your interest and support for Honest Reporting.
Thank you. David.
Okay, look, thank you also, Dov. Great session. Your enthusiasm is palpable. Now, just finishing up by us asking for everybody here, if you're not doing the 3 things listed under support HAA, please do so. Like and follow the HAA Facebook page. Send an email if you're not yet on our email list, and you shall be added. And of course, we encourage you to be formal members, and we need your financial support if you are able to assist. And just foreshadowing next week, we are going into the deep end of the pointy end of politics with the director of CPAC Australia joining us. And for those of you who are not yet aware, HAA will be an active participant in the CPAC Australia meeting in November, and I've been invited to be a featured speaker on that occasion, which is a superb opportunity for us, and some remarkable people are involved in that event, including Senator Eric Abetz, Senator Molan, Rowan Dean, Ross Cameron, Craig Kelly MP, and many others, very strong supporters of Israel and our community. So that's it, Alan. We've got a lot to look forward to, and thank you everyone for this evening.
Okay, thanks David. Thanks Dov again. That's all for tonight. We look forward to joining you again next week. So for now, it's good night to you all. Thank you very much. Goodbye.